Good Monday, everybody, and welcome to Charting with Dan here on the new FANDOM Entertainment. Look at those graphics.
Fancy new graphics. And look, lower thirds. Fancy new lower thirds.
Fancy new lower thirds, fancy new graphics, fancy everything,
It's
Lon.
an exciting day.
It's a new name for the channel, but it's the same show. We're going to break down the box office numbers for you this weekend, plus the entertainment story that really mattered this weekend, that everyone was really talking about, was Game of Thrones. And a lot of you would say, like, how could you do that? This is a show about movies. Well, SEO finds a way. So...
We got to talk dragons.
No, actually, it's kind of exciting. We're going to look at some scenarios because a lot of people have asked this question or have pondered the fact that Game of Thrones is a television show, but it was pitched as a movie series for many, many years. How if let's step into an alternate dimension, Lon, and see if Game of Thrones had found the same kind of success as a film series that it has as a television series. If it had opened this weekend, how might it have done? We've got a few different scenarios for you that we're going to talk about later on the show. But let's talk about what actually did happen at the box office this past weekend. Shazam remained number one, just under $25 million. That was about a 54% drop in the second weekend. That's not terrible for a superhero film, although it did debut lower than a lot of other films. It's the third lowest in the DCEU, so only Wonder Woman and Aquaman dropped less on their second weekends, but there's an asterisk next to Aquaman because its weekend release schedule was very odd compared to the Christmas holidays. They were not typical 3-day releases, so it's not quite a one-to-one comparison there. But Wonder Woman, Aquaman, Shazam have the lowest second week drops in the DCEU.
Yeah, we talked last week about, was Shazam going to hold up more like a comedy or more like a superhero movie? It seems like it kind of split the difference almost.
It held up like a typical superhero movie.
Yeah.
It was about, I think Wonder Woman was, Captain Marvel was somewhere around like 55%. This was 54%. So even though Captain Marvel debuted higher percentage-wise, it was a similar drop. So not bad news for Warner Brothers and Shazam as far as what it did in the second week. Not spectacular news. If it had been like a 40% drop, that would have been incredible because you almost never see that with a film of that size. But 54% is pretty standard. So there you go. Pretty standard drop for Shazam. Of course, it's got one more week in the theaters before...
And the sequel's already moving forward. So if you like Shazam, worry not.
They're going to make a Shazam 2. The Rock's going to be in it. All of that stuff is still going to happen. Don't worry about it. Little opened at number 2 at $15 million. That was a little ahead of what people were expecting of it, largely because the other new entries were did not perform well. That left a little room for Little to do a little better than was expected. That's off a $20 million budget, so $15 million opening off a $20 million budget. Not a bad start. As I mentioned, it sort of filled the void going into the weekend. A lot of the conventional wisdom had said that Hellboy and Little would be potentially competing for that second spot. Little ended up taking it fairly easily, largely while it was not poorly received. Hellboy was.
Yeah.
Which is really what opened up that gap between 2 and 3. Hellboy at number 3. No good news. No good news for Hellboy here. It fell short of expectations, which were already pretty modest coming in. It opened with just over $12 million. That is about half of what 2004's Hellboy opened to. It's about a third of what 2008's Hellboy The Golden Army opened to. That's without adjusting for inflation. Those numbers would be even worse if you adjusted for inflation. Had a franchise worst cinema score with a C. Atrocious reviews. Lon, it's hard to look at Hellboy and see anything but
there's not much
disaster.
good to say for that. But I mean, I think one thing that really hurt it, aside from being pilloried by just about every critic out there, was that the other Hellboy movies were PG-13. And they had a lot of teenage and kid appeal. Right. And they were a much more cartoony, accessible, mainstream take on this material. This one's going for gore, hard R, which is more faithful to the comics, but also really limits the potential audience right off the bat. Even if the reviews had been slightly more positive, that probably would have impacted it.
Well, and you have a director in Guillermo del Toro with the first two, who certainly in 2004, a little bit less than 2008, but was a cult figure as far as, I mean, he had many fans, but he's far more well known now. He has a Best Director Oscar. He has a Best Picture winner under his belt than he was 11
certainly
to 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Certainly in 2004.
He was still coming out with, what, Mimic and...
Exactly. You've got Pan's Labyrinth going on and everything.
Devil's Backbone, and
But you have to wonder, if you could go in the Wayback Machine, if the studio could go back in the Wayback Machine. Obviously, that third Hellboy movie did not materialize for a reason, but perhaps If they had could do their druthers again and maybe redo the last 10 years differently, they would have made a different choice rather than waiting to do the reboot with David Harbour.
Or, I mean, this may be a character who's more well-suited to less big-budget, mainstream kind of projects, you know? Like, there may be an audience out there for more of, like, an animated series or a limited series or something that could hit horror fans and gore hounds and fans of the comic and not have to sort of aim for the megaplexes.
Well, there are certainly a lot of fans of the Del Toro movies because I mentioned in my review of the film that I had not seen the Del Toro films. It's just films that I have no grudge against. I didn't. A lot of people treated it as if I can't believe you didn't bother to see them. It's not that I didn't bother to.
You can't see everything.
You can't see everything, and I came into this Hellboy fresh. I really mentioned it just as a way of saying like, hey, I didn't come into this with any baggage because I didn't have the other two films.
Right.
But there are many, many people who love those Del Toro movies.
I love those Del Toro movies. I mean, I was a fan of the Hellboy comics, and the Del Toro movies, they're very different than the comics, but it's a really fun spin. They look great, and especially Golden Army, the second one, he really finds a way to merge his world and the world of Hellboy, so it feels like a Guillermo del Toro movie in a really cool way.
Well, not going to be a sequel to this Hellboy.
Oh, good Lord, no.
No Golden Army or any other kind of army for this Hellboy.
It doesn't look like we're going to get any more Hellboy films.
I think Hellboy might have been sealed into the underworld for a while, maybe in 10 or 20 years.
Or again, I could see a HBO show or a Netflix thing or something that is a little bit more tuned into the audience.
Rounding out the top 5, Pet Sematary, it dropped 60% in its second weekend. That's what we like to call a horror movie drop. 60% on a debut that wasn't exactly what people might have expected. Dumbo rounding out the top 5. And I was saying as I was putting this graphic together today, it really is indicative of the movie-going landscape that I had to put in parentheses 2019 next to 3 of the top 5 films at the box office. 3 of the top 5 remakes of older films. So there you go. 2 movies that were not in the top 5 that I should mention briefly. In 8th place, which usually we don't talk about an 8th place film, but in 8th place was as we mentioned last week, the Wattpad originated After.
Our friend in the booth, JT, saw After.
JT saw After. He's shaking his head.
He was not a fan.
I'm guessing he was in admiration of it. After opened in 8th place. The reason I'm mentioning it though is, first of all, it had a budget about $14 million, so its threshold is not huge for success. But next to the domestic numbers, which was it's not bad considering the budget and the audience it was shooting for, but overseas, it actually did well in several markets, enough that people are thinking that perhaps if they had pushed stronger here in the United States, it might have opened better. It pulled in about $18 million worldwide this weekend, which usually, again, pretty small number, but on a $14 million budget.
They're good-looking kids. I mean, that translates.
Apparently that's the one thing that translates worldwide.
Yeah.
A sad story, though, if you like stop motion animation,
which I do.
If you like the work of Laika, Missing Link, which was the newest film from Laika Studios, had the lowest opening of any wide release from that studio. Had really strong reviews. It had a B+ cinema score, which is not terrible.
And a good cast. I mean, this is Hugh Jackman, Zach Galifianakis, Zoe Saldana are the 3 characters.
You had an A-list cast, but Laika has just had progressively worse financial luck at the studio. Kubo and the Two Strings, which is a great movie that I loved, did not do well. Paranorman.
All their stuff is great. Box Trolls is great. Coraline.
And yet at the box office, it's literally diminishing returns. This is not good. I mean, Laika has famously been struggling for a while.
I think they've said this is going to be their last stop motion film for the time being. Like, they're not planning any other projects like this because they're just not paying for themselves.
I will say that I feel like maybe it's because of their limited resources, but they did not have an aggressive marketing strategy. I don't think they certainly didn't have an aggressive screening strategy. The screening invite never came through to me for the film. I would have loved to have seen it.
Yeah, a lot of people I know in the industry who wanted to review it didn't get invited to screenings, which is like, well, you're going to need that word of mouth for a movie like this.
And the reviews that it got were strong, so I think it may have just been a case of not a lot of resources to put behind it, which sometimes can be a self-fulfilling prophecy in the sense of it's hard to get the word out. People don't see it.
Yeah.
It's a chicken or the egg situation, but hopefully Laika will find a way forward because their work is beautiful.
The movies are sensational, and I don't know. I mean, I'm a little. I don't know what's going to happen with Laika because Travis Knight, the sort of the guy who's been running and the head animator who produces all these movies, he's kind of jumping over to live action now. He did Bumblebee.
Yeah.
So he's probably going to. I feel like we might be watching the winding down of Leica as an animation studio, which is a real shame because the movies are so terrific.
Yeah, they'll be leaving behind a great legacy if this is their last film or last film for a while. So Missing Link, unfortunately, not much of a box office splash there.
I will say anecdotally only, in Los Angeles, you can always tell when there's new animated movies that are coming out because they plaster every open wall with those posters where it's like Zendaya is Michi.
Yeah, the Zendaya is Michi.
Yeah.
Those are the kind of advertisements you see for animated films.
And
yeah.
I haven't been seeing a lot of those for Missing Link. So purely on an anecdotal level, they didn't get the word out like they did for what? Littlefoot was that?
That Smallfoot.
Smallfoot.
Yes, although I just call it Zendaya as Michi.
Right.
That was its lasting impression, at least on me. Let's look at the top per theater film. Her Smell, which is a film starring Elizabeth Moss, was the #1 film in 3 theaters nationwide, just over $12K per theater. It's from writer-director Alex Ross Perry.
Yeah. He did Listen Up Philip, which is a fun movie with Jason Schwartzman.
I haven't had a chance to see Her Smell, but on the surface, and maybe it's battling this, on the surface it appears to be a little similar to one of my favorite films of last year, Vox Lux,
Yes.
with Natalie Portman. It's about a music star struggling with dependence issues and trying to recapture glory, although Vox Lux was about relishing in that glory. But it seems thematically similar. This is another one that I didn't get a chance to see, but one of those smaller films that'll bubble up in the per theater average.
Is this I feel like this one may have a title issue also. It's hard for me to imagine a lot of people deciding to go see a movie called Her Smell.
Her Smell. One for Her Smell.
Yeah, I feel like they might have just kind of whiffed it on the title.
Yeah.
Yeah, he produced and wrote another one with Schwartzman called Seven Chinese Brothers. It's a fun indie comedy, but I think it's another one where the title because it sounds like a folk tale or something. I think it's just off-putting to people.
Yeah, Vox Lux was one too. That's like I love the movie, but I wonder how many people that saw the title like, what is this? That sci-fi? What is it? Vox Lux?
I think you kind of have to do a little bit. You got to meet people halfway.
Titles are weird though, because sometimes you nail it just like Ex Machina. Who would have thought that'd be a good title for a movie? And yet that was a perfect title for that movie. So I don't envy the person that has to choose what to name their movie.
No,
because
definitely not.
Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Let's look at the top 5 worldwide over the weekend. 4 of these 5 are holdovers from last weekend. Shazam, the #1 film, again, over $60 million. Then Dumbo, Pet Cemetery, the 3 remakes, Dumbo, Pet Cemetery, Hellboy, $22 million. That's worldwide.
It's everywhere altogether.
It opened in a lot of different markets this weekend, so also not much hope. Its only saving grace is that its budget was superhero movie low, about $50 million, but it opened to $22 million worldwide. Still has some markets to open in, but
it's a tough sale. There's not a marketable international star in it. It's not a property that's that well known.
It's difficult.
A lot of strikes against it.
The Hellboy, again, not getting a lot of help from the worldwide markets. And P-Storm from last week, #5. I just like saying P-Storm.
Who doesn't, really?
P-Storm, the #5 movie of the weekend worldwide.
I'm going to try to see P-Storm. I'm very curious as to what I'm very curious about this franchise because all of the letters are different. It's like K-Storm, Q-Storm, P-Storm.
Well,
I want to understand.
That is one of the advantages that I sadly don't do not avail myself of here in Los Angeles, is that a lot of the Asian cinema of films like P-Storm and The Wandering Earth and Wolf Warrior 2 and all of these do play in Los Angeles.
Yes.
I just don't take advantage of that often enough.
Yeah,
myself.
there's a theater that's pretty near me in Koreatown that shows a lot of these movies, and I often think about going, and then I don't.
So, Lana, a reason why some of these grosses may have been a little low is that, of course, what most people were talking about this weekend was the season 8 premiere of Game of Thrones. It is the last season, so obviously the hype is going to be at a fever pitch.
Sure.
Game of Thrones is really interesting in that it seems to be doing what Breaking Bad did, where when Breaking Bad left, when it self-canceled, if you will, it never declined in viewership. It gained viewers season over season until its last season was its most watched.
Right.
If the trends continue, based on what we've seen from last night's episode, Game of Thrones will be another show that pretty much follows that same pattern. It has built an audience season over season and seems to be ending at its high point.
Yeah.
It set a new series record last night for a season premiere. But as often I do, I sit and wonder, there's never going to be an ironclad one-to-one comparison between how a movie does and how a television show does. It's just impossible. You can't
There's
do
so
it.
many variables that you can't control, like how many people are in the room watching the show together, and that's
Yes. Exactly. These are the things that you can never know. But I decided to look at the numbers that came in today, how many people watched the show. I did an unscientific poll of my own to kind of get a handle on some things. And I wanted to just sort of posit some scenarios about how might a Game of Thrones movie have done in theaters this weekend in an alternate world where this was, let's say, the 8th Game of Thrones film, or they released 7 in a row or something. Again, you'll never get a one-to-one comparison, but to try to put into box office terms the pop culture phenomenon we're seeing that is Game of Thrones. So the easiest thing to do first was to look at just the pure sheer numbers that were given out. The number that came out today, as I mentioned, HBO announced that it was a series record for Game of Thrones. Last night, across cable and HBO streaming platforms, HBO Go and HBO Now, HBO says that 17.4 million people watched the season premiere of Game of Thrones last night across their different platforms. So the easiest thing to do, and we could have just given you this number and called it a day, is take those 17.4 million people, multiply that by the average 2019 ticket price, which right now is $9.03. And see,
I envy you guys.
What is the? I wish. What is the one-to-one comparison? So let's say all the 17.4 million people or viewers that HBO says watched last night. Let's say every single one of those people had gone and bought a ticket to see Game of Thrones this weekend. Right. What would that opening have looked like? Well, by that metric, HBO would have had the 17th highest opening of all time. That would have translated to a $157 million opening, just above Rogue One, A Star Wars Story, just below The Hunger Games Catching Fire, and the highest opening for an R-rated film, because let's face it, it would have been all time. So if you're taking those 17.4 million viewers that HBO, and you just say that each one of those bought a ticket, that's what it would have opened to this weekend if every reported viewer had gone to the theater and watched Game of Thrones. $157 million. Not too shabby.
No, great.
Not too shabby.
Better than I thought.
Yeah, not too shabby at all. But I also got to thinking about something, which is that, and I did some research on how ratings, because so many times they'll report, for example, the Super Bowl, 100 million people watched the Super Bowl, or 17 million people watched Game of Thrones. But what they can't meter, they can meter whether a cable channel or a DVR is watching a show, and they can certainly meter whether HBO is streaming to HBO Go or HBO Now, whether they've played that show. They can count that number, that's very easily. But what they can't meter is how many people are physically sitting in front of a television and watching. And so that's what I also wanted to look into, which is that we know HBO's got the numbers that it was viewed 17.4 million times. But how many people were actually watching Game of Thrones more than any other show since maybe Lost?
Yeah, it's a group party viewing show. Yeah.
So I wanted to do a little bit of scientific, or should I say non-scientific experimentation, and see of the people that watched the show last night, how many of the people watched it alone, or how many other people did they watch it with? So this is the results of a Twitter poll. Again, this is not scientific, and I'm never claiming that it is, but it was just out of curiosity. How many people watched the show? Out of everyone that watched the show, how big was their watch party? I got about 4,500 responses, which isn't too shabby.
That's pretty good.
46% of people watched it alone, so a little under half of the people were watching by themselves. About a quarter of the people, 25%, responded that they watched it with one other person. 18% said that they watched it with 3 to 5 people, and 11% of the audience that responded to my poll that watched it last night said they watched it with 5 people or more. I had people saying 10, 20, 40 people.
I would never do that. It's too loud. I need to focus.
That's what most people said. They either said, like, I loved watching it with my friends, or I watch it alone because I demand silence.
I feel like, 3 other people who are also very into it and going to pay attention is like the max. After that, it's like, no. Get out of here.
So if you extrapolate from those numbers, taking that 17.4 million viewers number that HBO gave us, and then I sort of extrapolated out from that and said, like, well, okay, if 50% of those were people watching alone, then I know that that's about 8.5 million people. And then, if that 25% were 2 people, then you add more to that. Yeah. What I came down to is that there was a potential audience last night of 40 to 50 million people. Now, I'm not saying that many people did watch the show, but I'm saying it's very possible that 40 to 50 million people could have been watching the show last night.
Or at least were present while it was
while it was playing, were present while it was on. And that actually matches up with a lot of the data that HBO has shared, which is that after a month of an episode, I think they said that last season, around 32 to 33 million people were watching every episode. If you add the fact that they're experiencing growth season to season, and it looks like it may be very strong growth this season, I decided to go on the lower end, but let's say a potential pool of 40 million people watching an episode. That's obviously a lot more than the reported number, but again, let's go best case scenario, and let's say 40 million people did watch the show last night, and
would have paid.
And let's say
all
paid
$7-10 to get
exactly. Let's say all 40 million of those people had bought a ticket to go see Game of Thrones at the theater this weekend. What would that have looked like? Well, we would have had a huge banner headline on the show today because we would have had the biggest opening weekend of all time. If, let's say, with an audience of 40 million people, if they had all bought a ticket to see Game of Thrones, we would have had that should not say 158 million. That is an incorrect number. I don't have the actual number, but that is inaccurate. It would have been the highest opening of all time.
Wow.
Beating Avengers Infinity War, beating Star Wars The Force Awakens. I apologize that number is wrong.
We'll figure it out.
Long story short, and a little peek behind the curtain, we revised all of our graphics today for charting.
Because it's Fandom Entertainment now.
Yeah, because it's Fandom Entertainment. So I apologize for not catching that mistake. I can go back and correct that number. I'll pin it in the comments. But if all those 40 million people had bought a ticket to see Game of Thrones, it would have been the highest opening weekend of all time. But let's be honest.
Wow.
That's not going to happen.
A lot of those people were like, they were there to hang out.
Yes.
They wanted to see their friends and drink some wine. They
Yes.
probably wouldn't have paid to go to the theater.
Or even let's say all those 40 million people were interested in watching the show. TV watching habits and movie watching habits are different.
Right.
Just because you watch a TV show at home on a Sunday night doesn't mean that you're going to go out to the theater in the same numbers.
You might have seen it. I'll see that next weekend.
Exactly.
Like, even if you were going to see it at some point, you might have waited for VOD.
So I wanted to correct for that a little bit. And the other thing that I looked at is I looked at the highest opening weekend of all time, which was Avengers Infinity War. And I also looked at the highest rated R opening weekend of all time to see if the numbers changed a little bit when you're aimed at a more adult audience. But both of those openings bore out that about a third of the total gross was made on the opening weekend. So I adjusted that 40 million pool. So let's say you have that same pool of 40 million people, but only a third of that number go out on opening weekend to see it, meaning 2/3 of the gross is going to be made.
They'll catch it later.
In the next 2 weeks, or that Friday, that next week, the next 3 or 4 weeks. What would have happened if you take that pool of 40 million potential people and a third of them go out on opening weekend, which is about what you see as far as total gross from Infinity War, from Deadpool 2. This is how it would have looked. You would have had an opening weekend around $119 million, just above Spider-Man Homecoming, just below Shrek the Third, around the 38th highest. But again, one of the top 50 openings of all time. That number would put it as the 4th highest R-rated opening of all time, just below it and Deadpool, amongst others.
Yeah.
So that's where it would have been if you look at, total pool, a third of them coming out on opening weekend. There's a lot of different ways that you can look at these numbers, but what I found, and I tried several different iterations, I thought these were the most interesting, but what I found was that we all know that Game of Thrones is a phenomenon. It's a pop culture phenomenon. But what I find interesting is that I think any way that you shape the numbers is that even cinematically, if it were not on television, if they were films instead and they had the same kind of fan following, they would be holding their own with the Marvels, with the MCUs, with the animated openings, with the Deadpools of the world, which I think is crazy to think about this weird alternate world if they had somehow captured that same George R.R. Martin magic and created a film series as popular as the TV series is. We would be adding to or redefining what R-rated films could do, what fantasy films could do. But we're seeing this phenomenal success on television as well.
One other fascinating thing to just sort of throw in here, like, unlike most TV shows, this isn't, if you have cable, you don't necessarily get HBO. It's also crossing this threshold of people have to specifically sign up for HBO. It's not like Discovery Channel where it's like part of your cable package.
Right.
So that's even another big barrier they had to cross, was only HBO subscribers can even watch Game of Thrones. This isn't out of the whole pool of every TV viewer in America.
And that's why I suspect, like I talked about that 17.4 million people, how many of them would have gone to see it on if this were a movie on opening weekend? I think quite a bit of them, because it's not like the Super Bowl where it's just on and you can go see it. Like, you have to take extraordinary measures to watch it. You either have to find your friend that has HBO, You subscribe to HBO, which
Right.
means that you're not afraid to shell out the extra money to go and see something. I would, if someone were to do a poll of people that watch Game of Thrones every week, I would suspect that you have, even more than so many other TV shows, a very highly motivated audience that will seek out and find this content when and where they make it. And so it's one of those Rick and Morty things where I wish I could just shoot a portal gun into some alternate dimension where Game of Thrones was a hit movie franchise, because I would love to see what kind of noise it was making in that dimension. As I mentioned, this is all extrapolations and guesses based on numbers, just on percentages and polls. There's no way to actually tell what it would be doing. But bottom line is there's so few of these phenomena that are cross-platform, across age groups, across social class, you name it. Like, so many people are wrapped up in this show. And the number of things that get this kind of penetration are dwindling.
Especially on television. The more streaming platforms we get, there's so much content out there that there's very few shows that still week to week bring millions of people together. It's become this very fractured, like, oh, have you watched Narcos Mexico yet? I just finished Turn Up Charlie. And we don't really have a lot of shows anymore that are like this, where it's appointment viewing. Everybody is going to watch it at the same time and tweet about it the whole time.
And keep in mind, this is the premiere numbers. I can't wait to see what the series finale numbers for HBO and Game of Thrones are going to be. Because so often, again, with Breaking Bad, I think, and you can fact check me, and I'm sure someone will on this, I believe that the series finale was the most watched episode of the show ever, which happens with shows that generally go out on a high note and go out while the getting is good. So I am super anxious to see also what the show does with the series finale, and who knows, maybe we'll have to revisit some of these numbers when that happens.
And is Bran the Night King? We need to know.
Who knows? No one knows except for probably like two to 3 dozen people.
Several
probably.
people.
Yeah, several people know, but they're not saying anything. Lon, let's look at the 2019 domestic chart. Let's see how the box office looks here in North America for the year so far. A couple of movements. Us is now the second highest grossing movie of the year. I would not have pegged Us outgrossing How to Train Your Dragon 3, which speaks for the performance of both films.
Us is what may be the weirdest movie to ever be ranked this high at this point in the year.
Yeah, I agree.
This is a powerfully strange movie.
It is an odd movie, and to see it up at number 2.
I really liked it, but wow.
Over How to Train Your Dragon 3, over Toothless and Hiccup.
Not what I was expecting.
That is pretty nuts. Another weird movie, also there at number 4, Glass, The Upside at number 5. Shazam debuts on the chart. It was just barely off the chart last week. It debuts on the chart at number 7. It's creeping up on Lego Movie there too. I bet it jumps over that and may jump over The Upside. And who knows, depending on the week and the weekend, may jump up over Glass next week. You can see that in the top 5 next week. Dumbo struggling to get towards 100 million. That is like 100 and the budget on that movie was insane, and it's not quite doing what it needs to do.
They'll get it back at some point. They can't be that worried about flipping a profit on that one. And it's also, at this point, they're just chalking all these failures up to like, well, we'll put it on Disney Plus. It'll be something to watch.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, it's a great piece of content.
It's a great Disney Plus piece of content.
Alita Battle Angel drops 2 spots. It's down at number 9. And Medea Family Funeral drops down to number 10. And Escape Room, the little movie that could, drops off the top 10, but it's fine. There's going to be a sequel pretty soon.
Well done, Escape Room.
Well done, Escape Room.
You hung in there.
Except for the movie, which I didn't really enjoy so much. But you did a great job marketing it. So good job, and another win for low budget horror. And then the 2019 worldwide box office. Let's take a look at that. Captain Marvel still over $1 billion.
Sure.
Wandering Earth, the top 5 are all the same. Dumbo jumps up internationally. It's at about $267 million. Shazam makes its debut at number 7. Again, depending on how the next week/weekend goes, I don't know if it's going to jump up in the top 5 in the next week, but it's going to end up in the top 5 pretty soon, although Avengers might knock it back out or keep it out. Who knows? Pegasus dropping down 2, Glass dropping down 2, Us also dropping down 2. Lego Movie 2 drops out. That is... I think that's really flown under the radar as far as a really surprising underperformance of 2019. A lot of people have covered other films. That one just seemed to come and go so quickly that nobody really noticed. But I'm honestly really, really surprised at how little traction that movie got.
Yeah, I mean, it could be something that there's just a lot of kids, families, animated things that people are going to wait for video or streaming on it. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. This week opening, 2 wide releases opening. One of them is Breakthrough, which is from Fox. This is Easter weekend, so it's sort of aimed. It is aimed at the Christian audience, Christian-themed audience. They could make a lot of money this weekend. We'll see what happens. And Disney Nature is opening a new film called Penguins, which is about penguins.
Penguins.
As
Benedict Cumberbatch
Penguins,
might say.
yes, opening this weekend as well. Then we've got next weekend, we've got the Curse of La Llorona opening, and then everything goes crazy.
Yeah.
That's
after that, all bets are off.
Or Endgame. I keep saying Infinity War.
Yeah,
I keep
Endgame.
saying Infinity War. When Endgame.
You know what I just thought of? Well, great thing to end on. So what's the opposite of infinity? Something that has an end. And what's the opposite of a war? A game.
Endgame, Infinity War. You just blew my mind,
Just
Lon.
end the show. I'm not going to break my glare.
I'm going to think about that, and you should too. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.